So, in this session we are going to continue looking at a few more tools on the server side attacks that could be used for penetration testing. So, we actually had looked at a few of the tools before, and in this session we are going to look at a tool called WebSlayer. So, what exactly is a WebSlayer? We were discussing briefly about the brute force mechanism of actually trying to find out the credentials, the user credentials that could be potentially used for entering into a web server. So, WebSlayer is basically a brute force tool, is one of the brute force tools that is actually used as a web application. So, I could actually use this tool to sort of brute force the form details like the username, password combinations, and also look at the get and the post parameters. So, the tool WebSlayer is not typically used in a standalone manner, but it is actually used along with a few plugins for Firefox that is actually available. So, we will actually see them how they have got to be made use of. So, WebSlayer can basically attack any part of the HTTP request such as headers and authentication. So, it could actually make use of details that is there as part of the header information as well as details that is there as part of the authentication, right. So, it could actually brute force password details from a standard dictionary file to find out if it is actually also matching any standard password that could potentially be used for that particular user combination on that web server, right. So, first what we would actually need to do is in order for this to actually work to the fullest possible extent, we need to capture the HTTP request and then do a login attempt so that we would be able to get the user agent details as well as the content, the rest of the content needed for the attack. So, in quite a few situations the web server would actually be differing in its behavior depending on which browser actually try to establish the connection to it, right. So, how does the web server come to know about the browser is basically with respect to the value that is actually filled up in the user agent field of the client request. So, in order to gather the user agent request that is actually required to be part of what we feed in as an input into the WebSlayer as well as maybe the rest of the headers as well, we first try to do a capture of the HTTP request to the same server from which we get these details and then feed this as an input into the WebSlayer tool. So, Firefox basically offers a plugin called live HTTP headers which is actually downloadable from the Firefox plugin site, which we could potentially make use of to gather all the information that we require for attempting a login to this particular target system, right. So, this is basically the live HTTP header screenshot where when we attempted to find out what kind of headers are used when a request from the browser is going to the web server, you had all the details that is presented here. So, you have a user agent, you have accept language and so on, right. So, for example, even you could actually get the cookie related details also which is typically used by some servers to sort of allow or deny access to certain parts of their content as well as to find out what did this particular client do when it accessed this particular server sometime back in the past. So, the most important parts of the information that is actually captured from this live HTTP plugin is the user agent and the login credentials. So, the user agent field as we were discussing will basically be containing the details about the client that actually try to initiate the attack. So, you have a Mozilla /5.0 all this actually listed from which platform this particular client request has actually come in, which browser, which version of the browser, which version of the OS, for example the Mac OS that is running there and so on and so forth. So, all these basically comes in as part of the user agent, and sometimes we will also basically make use of the authentication fields, like for example we have the email as the authentication field here with the UID and then the password combination here, right. So, depending on which site we are actually trying to get in or try to brute force enter, we might have to actually use part of these details that is being captured by this live HTTP plugin. So, what are we going to do? We are going to open up the WebSlayer and sort of in the attack setup tab, we are going to first enter the URL field. So, this URL field will be the server that we are actually trying to brute force attack with some sort of random username password combination. So, whatever is a target field target URL that we are trying to attack will actually be entered as part of this URL field, right, along with maybe the headers and the post data that was actually captured as part of my live HTTP plugin, right. So, now I actually have an option to basically set the payload type. So, which could actually be a dictionary, range, or a known set of payloads. So, when I say dictionary, what we actually mean here is that if we want to really try to find out by brute force method what kind of password are actually used, right. So, I could really have a set of strings in a particular file which I could mark as possible passwords that needs to be attempted to be checked and then give that as a dictionary file, or I could basically have the range set so that if for example I need to let us say that we are actually having the credit card as one of the data fields in my HTML form that is going to be submitted as part of the post request to the server, right. So, when we know credit card, again I have different types of credit card that is possible. So, let us say a Visa card or a MasterCard or whatever it is, and all these if you strictly observe has a particular range associated with that. So, if I for example say that I want to use a Visa MasterCard range, I could potentially have the range setting done from a particular starting number to a particular ending number, at least the first the few digits of the number, and put a pattern associated with that. So, that the attack will actually be done starting from that particular number and ending up to that number that has been mentioned as part of the range field here. And similarly, I could also set the payload setting appropriately by sort of doing an import of a payload from the payload generator tab. So, we will be actually looking at the payload generator tab subsequently, but that is basically a dynamic form of generating what has to be submitted as a payload for doing this brute force attack to get the authentication details. So, here if you see I specify the URL, whatever the URL that we are going to be actually trying to target to do a brute force attack, and you see the word fuss here, FUZZ, this is a keyword that I will basically come to. So, whatever has been the headers that has been captured from the live plugin of my Firefox that we just saw a few slides back, I basically take those header fields and then put it in here, and if at all there is any specific post data that I want to really use. So, like for example, this particular WebSlayer tool works most of the times only if we actually give the correct username. So, if we give the username, it basically tries to find out how it could actually do a brute force attack and get the corresponding password for that username. So, suppose if we want to specify the username as part of the post field, so we could actually mention it here. And then if you see here, there are different options that is there, like the payload type and what kind of parameters has to be injected and what kind of authentication and so on and so forth, and we see the dictionary options that is here, right. Now, we were talking about the keyword called fuss. So, the moment we say fuss, the WebSlayer tool basically takes this as a keyword for it to basically take the strings one by one from the specified dictionaries here and then inject it for one request by replacing the word fuss here. For example, if I basically have the post data where I am specifying the username field and then I specify the password field, password equal to FUZZ, there what it would actually do is it would basically take the strings one by one from the two dictionaries that has been actually mentioned here, whatever has been selected as part of the drop down menu option here, and then replace that for the password field, because I have specified password as first, right. But since it has actually been mentioned, this keyword first has actually been mentioned as part of the URL field. So, what we are actually trying to find out here is a valid URL field location or a list of possible URL targets that will be available as part of this particular web application, right. So, this is one example by which we could really try to find out what kind of subdirectories or subfolders are there under my web application, right. So, by doing it in this manner and then saying start, the tool is actually going to start working, and then I am going to basically have a list of, if you see here, so we will actually have the list of URLs and the outputs for every attempt that it has actually made, right. So, you see the different payloads here, and then it has actually found out that for CGI-bin as the payload from one of the files, dictionary files that has been given, it has actually found out to be a valid URL, because of which you see a different color associated with this, right, like as compared to the rest of the colors, right. So, another way of using this is, as I was telling you, we could actually have the keyword first selected as part of my password field, and so whatever has been actually set as a payload or as my dictionary in this particular example, the word first, the keyword first will actually be replaced by different strings coming out of that payload or from the dictionary file, and then for each run the replacement of this keyword will actually happen with the string from the given payload or the given dictionary file, and then it will attempt to see if it is getting a valid response back, right. So, this is another possible way by which this could potentially be made use of. So, the authentication tab has basically got different security options. Here in this particular case the authentication has been set as basic, but if you see the drop down menu there, you would also see some sort of other authentication options that you could potentially make use of to do a different kind of brute force testing mechanisms on the selected URL. So, coming down to the payload generator. So, what exactly is the payload generator? So, the payload generator is a tool that one can make use of to create custom payloads. So, I could actually have different types of dictionaries concatenated together, possibly I could have different numeric ranges, I could have character blocks. So, if I know that there is a particular password combination, password pattern that is enforced by the server, saying that it should always be starting with a character or it should always be starting with a numerical number, right. I could actually appropriately have different payloads in which I specify the pattern, saying that first digit should always be starting from 1 to 9, right. The first character should, because of the requirement the first character should be a number, it should be starting from 1 to 9 and so on and so forth, right. So, I could actually have different kinds of possible permutations on this different inputs that I could potentially give as part of my payload, and the payload generator tool is something that is going to help me to build a complete set of payloads, which I could potentially concatenate all of them together and then create one final payload that is actually uploaded as part of my attack tab in the tool for doing a customized attack. So, if I basically look at the example here, so that I have a tool saying I have a setting with the range for the payload generator, saying that the range should be from 0 to 1000, right. So, from 0 to 1000 I actually have the full payload that is actually generated, and either I could actually add this as part of my pre-existing payload, or I could really have this as a separate file and so on, depending on my specific requirement, so that the values that has actually been taken as part of the payload here would also be part of my brute force testing to see if any of those generated payload data here as part of my specific range input that I have given is also matching with the maybe the URL or maybe the password combination or whatever I am actually trying to brute force test that particular server with, right. So, with the payload generator I would actually be able to also generate a customized payload which would turn out to be very powerful, especially when the particular web application server that we are trying to brute force test is having a very complicated a password and a very highly secure password authentication mechanisms, and also sorts of enforces it mandatorily. So, in that kind of a scenario, having a customized payload generator with different kinds of permutations and combinations helps us to make sure that our payload that is being submitted as part of the attack is something that is very comprehensive, with a very high chance of determining and being successful in the brute force testing. So, here in this case, if you also see, the attack results will actually be available as part of this particular tab finally once the testing is completed. So, likewise you have the logs and so on. So, these different menus you could really play around with and try to get yourself familiar, because this particular tool is a tool that is very handy and very powerful, especially when we need to do brute force testing on a web application server. Thank you.